The aims is to stop the radicalization of young Muslims. The concern is they may be tempted to fight for ISIL or other extremist groups in the Middle East. The focus of the opening session is domestic extremism. The U.S. president will address the summit on Thursday on the international threat. He'll speak to representatives from about 60 countries. For more on the international efforts to fight extremism, we're joined by Scott Bates. He's president of the Center for National Policy, a think tank based here in Washington. Let's talk about this summit here in Washington. One of the goals to try and stop the radicalization of these younger people. Easier said than done in many respects, isn't it?
There's no doubt about that, but this is not the first chapter in that struggle. So in 2011, the White House launched a national strategy to engage communities, empower local groups to try and counter extremism in their own communities. And some pilot projects have been set up in Boston, St. Paul, Minneapolis area, and other places around the United States. So there's been some success in bringing law enforcement together with community-based organizations and faith leaders to really try to present an alternative to young people that might be losing their way.
Well, let's expand on that a little bit, because St. Paul and Minneapolis, very interesting, a huge Somali population there, ripe targets. What are the success stories there? I mean, are we seeing success there?
Well, I think you can point to success in that you're talking about something like 7 million Muslims in the United States. And those that have been radicalized, I can't even begin to describe how tiny a proportion of the population that is. So the vast majority of young Muslims in the United States are great citizens and contribute to security here and abroad, fighting in the armed services of the United States. So I think the dogs that don't bark, if you will, the idea that the incidents that don't happen are very hard to prove as a success. But if you look globally, incidents inside the United States have been rare, isolated, and while tragic when they occur, have been not networked as in the past, and kind of 9/11 attack, but it's been mostly lone wolf or mentally unstable individuals.
You know, it's interesting, U.S. News and World Report, I'm just going to lift a passage from how they described the summit. From the outside, however, the summit appears hastily organized and fraught with gaps. There's been some criticism here. The Washington Examiner calling it the softer, gentler terrorism summit. Are these well-deserved or not?
You've got to use all levers of national power to counter a threat like radical extremism. So the United States, for over a decade, has had our armed forces at the tip of the spear across the globe fighting extremists. We've also prepared ourselves here in the homeland by setting up the Department of Homeland Security. But the third element of that is countering the ideology that gives rise to extremists. If you don't do that, then it's perpetual war. And that's not always the best way to counter these kind of things. So I think that to say that it's soft somehow is incredibly misguided. Otherwise, all you're doing is pouring endless resources into endless war. And so you have to have all levels of national power. At this summit, there's the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, and community leaders all over the country. But, you know, the United States has great experience in using the hard elements of national power. I would say this is a smart strategy to combat what is a serious threat.
Just basically, when you look at it from the domestic piece of this, and of course the president's going to be addressing an international group later, is it basically getting these groups together and brainstorming, coming up with ideas? This is working in my community, it might work in your community. This is working in my country, this might work in your country. Or is it just basically getting these people together so that you can pick up the phone and say, hey, I've got this issue? I mean, what do you see coming out of this?
The answer is yes to both of those. So there are some lessons learned that are going to be shared at panels today, tomorrow, at the summit. There are leaders from 60 different countries that are gathered, community leaders, not just kind of talking heads or officials. So these are people on the front lines in their communities. That kind of information sharing can lead to lessons learned, but you're right, it's not having to call up after a crisis, but preventing it before and building the bridges that can help accomplish that goal.
So you definitely see this as a plus?
Oh, I think it can't hurt, and I see it as really the opening in what will be a years-long struggle. And the more bridges we build, the stronger we're going to be.
All right, Scott Bates, thanks so much for coming in. Really
Thank you.